Hi, I'm Elizabeth Floyd, and I'll be your instructor for this course, POLS 308 and LEG 308 online, called Law, Politics, and Society. I hope each of you will take the time and have already taken the time to read through the course syllabus very thoroughly. You must do that in order to understand what's going to be going on in this class. After you listen to this lecture using the PowerPoint, I urge you to pay attention to the assignments in the agenda and make sure that you get them done by their deadlines. I'm going to start with my lecture now on Chapter 1 of the textbook, Law, Its Function and Purpose. And through this lecture and your study of the chapter, I hope you'll accomplish these objectives. First, I expect you to master a conceptual understanding of what law is through its relationship to culture and its adaptation and importance over the course of history. Then I want you to be able to identify several of the philosophers and social scientists who are in your chapter and be able to match them to their most important ideas about the purpose of law. And then at last, I hope you'll be able to compare and contrast and give examples of the concepts that are listed here in the objectives. You'll see many of them in bold print throughout the PowerPoint. So let's start with that first objective. What is law? Your textbook attributes it to its origin to several Latin and Nordic words that meant to bind. But no one really knows where the word law came from. Still, the fact that it comes from a group of words that mean to bind suggests that originally law was a verb, not a noun. And when you think about it, defining law really just comes from realizing what laws do for us, what their purpose is. Is the purpose of law to bind people together into cultures? In this chapter, we'll learn some of the ideas that several scholars had about the purpose of laws, and I'll get to that in a minute. But for now, I want to spend some time answering this question. Is the purpose of law to bind cultures together? Now, I've included this picture of Moses and the Ten Commandments in my PowerPoint, not to suggest that God or the Bible was the origin of all law. Rather, this picture actually reflects two different perspectives of the law. The Ten Commandments were the origin of Jewish law, the law of a specific culture. And the Jewish culture elaborated on the Ten Commandments a lot, to the point that their law included thousands of detailed rules for Jewish daily life. So even if the Jews believed that the original 10 laws came from this external, timeless, supernatural source, the God of all creation, their laws became the be-all, end-all defining aspect of what it meant to be a Jew, a specific culture. So let's look then at cultures. Now, on this slide, you see identified six different aspects of every culture, things that are beliefs, values, norms, symbols, technology, and language. And in our study, I'm going to start with the simplest of these, and that's symbols. How is law connected to a culture's symbols? Well, symbols represent things, obviously. And the images that I have on this slide here are symbols from Western European culture. And they are symbols of value, of our values, justice, equality, and the rule of law. So you have this picture of Themis Justia. She's blind, and that's to represent that Western European society values fairness and the objective application of laws. The scales of justice show that this culture values equality and weighing and balancing the interests of all people. Also, these symbols of law show that we respect the law. They are symbols such as this austere courtroom you see there. That's the chambers of, well, not the chambers, that's the courtroom for the U.S. Supreme Court with these grand columns. And there's a lot of detailed architecture that you can't see in the picture, but you could see if you were there in person. And it's to inspire respect for the law. And it shows that our culture does hold the law up on a pedestal. We respect the rule of law. A law, or all laws, are really useless if they aren't respected. And no one's going to obey them if they aren't respected. That's one of the reasons they're so important. So law is certainly intertwined with a culture's symbols. That's easy to see. Now, what about language? How is law connected to a culture's language? Well, that's pretty obvious too. We use language to convey and discuss our law. More primitive cultures could only talk about their laws, not having access to means of recording or conveying laws in some other way. But writing technologies changed the way cultures dealt with the law. There is even a principle in your textbook on page 9. The more complex a culture becomes, the more it relies on written codes of conduct. And that is certainly true. But keep in mind that even pre-literate cultures had laws. They just used the word of mouth to enforce them. Yet, as technology advances, so do the way our laws are conveyed and recorded. And that gives me a nice little segue to the next slide, technology. How is law connected to a culture's technology? And I've just alluded to it. Technology affects everything, including how laws are conveyed and applied and enforced and recorded. And as technology changes, so does everything else. For example, evidence collection. So back then, we had powders and magnifying glasses and the astute observation of humanity, such as you see with Sherlock Holmes, logic. That's how we would collect evidence and enforce the law. But nowadays, we have modern technology. We have body cameras and cell phone videos and laboratory equipment, DNA, fingerprint analysis, all these means of technology for enforcing and investigating. What about recording our laws and conveying them? So back then, we only had rolls of papyrus and engraving into stones in order to record our laws. But technology allowed us to use paper and pencil and pen to record our laws in books, as you see in that tremendous library. And even more recently, now we have the internet to convey and record our laws. You can get the law on in cyberspace. So it's easy to see then this connection with how law is conveyed, how laws are enforced, how laws are investigated. But also there's another way that technology is connected. Technology gives us new crimes to prevent and new ways to address its consequences. So for example, the advances in technology gave us the internet. I just mentioned that. But with the internet came internet pornography, and we had to develop laws to prevent and control and punish internet pornography. With advances in medical technology, we got stem cell research. Well, that gave us some ethical consequences, and we developed laws and regulations to control our use or not using embryonic stem cell research. The same with industrial waste and pollution. All our great industries created smog, And in order to protect our environment, we had to pass laws regulating industrial waste and pollution. So those are the easier ones. It's easy to see the connection with law in technology and language and symbols. And you might say, oh, of course, law is a defining aspect of a time-specific culture. But let's think about it a little bit more deeply for these next three aspects of culture: beliefs, values, and norms. So what are beliefs? Beliefs are ideas about what is true and what is false. And laws are enacted to support a culture's most deeply held beliefs about what is true and what is false. And as a culture's beliefs change, so do its laws. For example, when does life begin? If I asked you all to answer that question, I would likely get a variety of answers, and the discussion might develop into a debate over abortion laws. But consider this. Back then, before modern medicine, people believed that life began when a woman could feel her fetus moving in her womb. This was known as quickening. So women could terminate their pregnancies at any time before quickening without any legal consequence, because the child wasn't believed to be really alive until then. But over time, our culture began to believe that life begins when a fetus is viable, when it can survive outside of its mother's womb. And laws changed, beginning with Roe versus Wade, to accommodate the scientific belief of when a fetus becomes viable. But a significant segment of our society believes that life actually begins at conception. So they advocate for laws that preclude abortion long before viability. It is a political issue, and the current law does not necessarily reflect the belief of everyone in our culture. So it's not such an easy conclusion to say that law is nothing more than a social construct that is enforced by a particular society. It could be something more. Let's go on then with values. How is law connected to a culture's values? Values are similar to beliefs, but they're actually broader statements about what is right and what is wrong. And laws often reflect the broadest values of a given society, like the symbols of justice or equality that I showed you earlier. But think about it. What are American values that we hear politicians proclaim so often? We know that our Constitution, especially the preamble to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, profess American culture's values of freedom and equality and justice. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll see that in a more narrow sense, all people in a given culture do not share the same values. And that's why I use this particular image on my slide. It says, my American values. People of different political persuasions would have different ideas about what is meant by the word equality, for example. Do they mean equality of outcome, where everybody gets exactly the same piece of the pie? Or are you saying equality of opportunity, where everybody has the same opportunities to get something from that economic pie? Just depends on who you ask as to what they mean by that word. And so just to say that Americans value equality, well, what do you mean by that? And it might not be a reflection of what everyone considers to be true or right. We have to recognize that laws, in a narrow sense, may not represent the values of an entire culture, and laws may change depending on who is in charge of making them. Let's look at this now. Norms. How's law connected to a culture's norms? Norms are the action equivalent of beliefs and values. They are socially acceptable conduct. And you might say that our laws are simply our norms, written down and enforced by our government. Laws are codes of socially acceptable conduct. But think about this a little deeper as you look at these two pictures. You might have guessed what they are pictures of. They are both pictures of internment camps. The one on the left is a picture of an internment camp in Flossenbürg, Germany, circa 1942, where thousands of Jews were held in captivity. The one on the right is a picture of a Japanese internment camp in California, the United States, also circa 1942, where many Japanese Americans were held in captivity. In both situations, there were laws, rules, codes of socially acceptable conduct that permitted the captivity of not criminals, but innocent people based solely upon their ethnicity. At that time and at that place, it was legal, it was a norm to hold them in captivity. But now, the very same culture finds that abhorrent and definitely not legal, not true, not just, not right. And we might even punish those responsible for holding these innocent people in captivity. And in fact, we did. Americans, among other Allied powers following the World War II, prosecuted the Nazis for what they did to the Jews. These were known as the Nuremberg trials. And the argument was, well, the Nazi Party controlled Germany, and the Nazis had laws that permitted and indeed directed the capture, exploitation, and ultimate extermination of the Jews. How then is it fair to punish them for doing something that was legal in their country when it was done? To answer that question, you have to decide which of two perspectives you take on what the law actually is. One perspective is that called positive law, or a person being a positivist theorist. That means that law comes simply from the norms of a culture. Law is what it is, for better or for worse. Sometimes the laws are moral, sometimes they are not. But laws are simply a product of the culture that enforces it to represent that culture's beliefs, values, norms, etc. What matters is not whether the law is universally right, because morality is relative. What matters is whether there is an authoritative power to coerce compliance with it. That's just one perspective. The other is natural law. Natural law says that law is what it ought to be. What is right and what is wrong can be determined independently of any particular culture. Law places limits on what is permissible by any society. It is not all relative to a culture. One cannot rationalize abhorrent laws by simply connecting them to a culture. For example, in America, you used to be able to legally beat your wife with a stick of 1 inch diameter on the courthouse steps. But sitting here today, we know that that is certainly not legal, not right. You used to be able to own a human being in the United States. But we know that was not right, never just. It used to be illegal in Germany to slaughter an entire ethnic group. And yet in the Nuremberg trials, we showed, no, that is not right, not just, and not legal, never legal. And they were punished for it, or some were punished for it. So the natural law perspective then is that law is not just the word of a man holding a gun to your head. Those abhorrent rules were never valid law. So we come back then to our ultimate overriding question for this chapter. Are laws simply the rules of a given culture at a given time that are enforced by the culture and help to define it? That would be the positivist theory. Or are laws timeless, universal principles of right and wrong against which a given culture's rules or norms may be judged? That's the natural law theory. Laws are definitely intertwined with every aspect of an organized culture, and they do bind members together and reflect the culture's identity in some sense. But as you see, or you will see, as we go through the following the theorists that we're about to begin going through some of these theories, that there's great consensus that law is something far more than just a social construct. And I'm going to start here with our first Greek philosopher, Plato. I wonder if some of you are philosophy majors or have taken a philosophy course, and you would probably recognize Plato as one of the ancient Greek philosophers who created the notion of an academy, a group of people who would gather in these beautiful outdoor settings outside Athens, Greece, and argue about what the law was and what our ethics are. Plato was a student of Socrates, and one of his primary ideas was that there existed a class of entities. You've got to think very abstractly when you talk about Plato. He believed there existed a class of entities that were the ideal intangible form of things, such as good or beauty or equality or even humanness. This idea was called the theory of forms, and law was a form. It was an entity that existed wholly separate from the concrete rules that we apply to human conduct. He was a natural law theorist in the sense that he believed law was a form, something separate from our culture. And our positive laws, our rules that were written down in force, were simply imperfect copies of law in its ideal form. In order to arrive at this ideal form of law, we have to engage in debate and dialogue and talk about it and change our laws to accommodate our new ideas about what law is or should be. And the process that would be used for that dialogue, he called the Socratic method. Socrates was Plato's mentor and trainer, and he learned how to engage in this dialogue from Socrates. So now it's called the Socratic method. I've got a slide here where you can see an example of it just on your own time if you want to go back and read about it. But so Plato argued that we would achieve this ideal form of law through the Socratic method. And what we currently had, our rules, the positive laws of that culture, were really just a mistaken effort to reach that ideal. Now, Plato was something of an elitist. And so when we're talking about the Socratic method in this debate to arrive at law, we're talking about a very distinct group member of society, that the state is what he would call it. So only the state could engage in this debate, and the citizenry, individuals, couldn't be a part of it. He was something of an elitist, a product of that time. And what else he believed was that laws were absolutely necessary. He saw humanity as innately selfish and imperfect. So laws had to be debated and then enacted and passed and enforced in order to control society, to restrain ourselves from our innate conduct. Plato's theories, though, went on to influence subsequent philosophers, and you'll see as we get through this, it ultimately has shaped our own country. So one of those subsequent theorists then is Aristotle. Aristotle was somewhat more egalitarian than Plato, but he was also a student of Plato. He believed that law was more than a social construct. So like Plato, Aristotle adhered to natural law theory. Law is something external and not just connected to a specific culture of a specific time. However, being more egalitarian, he would say that even rulers are more subservient. Even rulers are subservient to the law. So the law rules, not man. And the goal of the law then is to achieve the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the next chapter, chapter 2, but you can know now that Aristotle believed that law and justice were the same thing. So law is just. It is whatever ensures that everyone gets what they deserve. There's a reward for good behavior and a punishment for bad behavior. Aristotle's theories also were passed down and ultimately wound up in the government we have today. Slightly more modern. Next, we have the philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes is very different than Plato and Aristotle. Hobbes was a pure positivist. He believed in positive law theory wholeheartedly. He believed that humans were, or humanity at large, were inherently brutish and selfish, and if left to their own devices, would ultimately destroy society. That humans would form social contracts, a social contract. So here you're being introduced to social contract theory with Hobbes. So Hobbes believed that humans enter into these social contracts with each other simply to preserve their own life. Like an agreement, I won't hurt you if you won't hurt me. That's your social contract. And the government is there to enforce that contract. And if we didn't have government, that contract wouldn't be enforced and we'd all kill each other. That was what Thomas Hobbes believed anyway. So in that sense, any government is better than no government at all. If you want to take a minute now, pause the video and go read the first paragraph of chapter 1 on page 1 of your textbook. There's an interesting scenario there that might make you agree with Thomas Hobbes, or might not, but it'll help you think. What he's talking about here is that we simply have to have a government in order to control ourselves, to restrain us from destroying each other. His beliefs were probably influenced by his time period. This was a time of the great civil wars in England, and so there was a good bit of bloodshed and chaos, and that may have prompted some of his thinking. As a reaction, though, to Hobbes was John Locke's theory. So John Locke was somewhat of a contemporary of Hobbes, and he was far more optimistic about humanity. He did not think we were innately brutish, selfish beings that would destroy ourselves and each other. He believed humans were born as simply blank slates. Okay, it's called tabula rasa in Latin, blank slate. And if we're bad, if we do things wrong, it's simply a product of our own experience. And we aren't born that way. So Hobbes then would be more of a natural law theorist. He believed that a higher law did exist, and that by nature all men are free and equal and independent, and they can abide together without killing each other. We don't need a government necessarily, but we agree together to have a government. Now, why would we do that? If we're all free and equal and independent, and we can all abide by this higher natural law of justice, why do we need a government? Well, in his opinion, government exists to ensure our freedom, to ensure our liberty, to protect it. So we consent to have a government to protect our freedom. And if that government ever fails to do its job, well, we can overthrow it and start again. That might sound a little familiar to you, and I want you to think about that a little bit more, where you might have heard that in some other location. Next, we'll talk about John Rawls. Now, John Rawls is a more modern theorist, a sociologist, and his opinions were somewhat similar. He was also a natural law theorist, And he connected it, he sort of treated it the same way you as scientists would treat a scientific principle. If a scientist determines that his principle is untrue, well, then you just change the principle. You throw it out and you develop your new principle. And he saw laws the same way. If we have a law that we later decide is wrong, you abolish it and you start again. So then in that sense, justice is subjective. It's constantly changing as we grow as a society. He also had an idea of something called original position. So, you have tabula rasa with John Locke. With Rawls, you've got original position. And it's sort of similar to Locke. He's saying that in our innate state, we do have a sense of what's just and good. So here you're hearing that natural law theory with Rawls. We can sort of understand what is right and what is wrong in our original position. And so we're going to construct this social contract with one another to organize our society. But in order to do that in a just way, we have to do it behind something he called the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance is just an idea that when you're making laws, you have to not know your position in the society you're trying to organize. Humans, in his opinion, humans would inevitably structure a society in a way that would favor themselves. So really, in order to do it in a fair way, you have to not know your place in society when you're organizing it. You have to have sort of a veil in front of you that blinds you to the type of person you might be in this society. What laws would you choose? If you had to enact a code of laws for society and you had no idea where you would fit into that society, well, of course, you would choose that everyone would have all the same rights and liberties and opportunities, because potentially you could be anyone. So for example, if you were deciding how to form a just society, you would blind yourself to your own race, gender, social and economic class, to what talents you might have or your level of education. Then you would decide how material wealth and opportunities would be distributed, and you would distribute them equally and fairly because you wouldn't know what you would be due to receive. So you just want everyone to get the same thing. That's what he was arguing for. So he was more of a believer in equality of outcome, but he didn't talk about it quite so directly. And he was definitely had a sense of natural law theory there. So we'll go on to a couple more sociologists, but before I do that, I wanted to point out their frame of reference for a sociologist is a little different than just your standard philosopher. Sociologists study law because they study society and its institutions. So they're going to approach law as the product and producer of social change, a response to social unrest. They're looking at an ever-changing society and trying to understand it and explain the changes that they see happening. So it's a little bit more concrete, a little bit less abstract. And I'll go then to our first sociologist, really, maybe our second, Max Weber. It's not pronounced Weber, it's pronounced Weber. So he's looking at the economy mostly in his time period and trying to figure out what type of laws produce the best, most efficient economic progress. Essentially, how did modern capitalism emerge? That's what he's witnessing now with the Industrial Revolution in his time period. So he's studying to see how law influenced the growth and development of modern capitalism. And he decided that to advance, a society must have formal, rational decision-making. Only when law is decided in a formal, rational way can it offer the predictability that is necessary for economic and social progress. So laws then are foundational. People have to feel that a certain conduct or a certain code of conduct would maintain order before they would take any risks. They rely on authority figures to enforce that code. So society needs that predictability in order to make choices, economic choices, or they won't take risk. They won't invest in things if they aren't somewhat sure of the outcome of their choices. So Weber came up with his theory about formal rational decision-making after analyzing these variables. So there are 4 variables: substantive, formal, rational, and irrational. So look at it. Let me define those for you, and then we'll arrive at what he arrived at, this 4-part typology of decision-making. So substantive means case-by-case basis. So you're not using any rules or precedent to make law. You're just taking a factual situation and deciding it case by case. You're not looking at the past. You're not comparing one case to another to come up with any kind of generalization. You're just deciding the case in front of you. The opposite of that then is formal. So formal decision-making is when you apply a generalized set of rules. So it's a procedural, systematic way of making decisions. And you're taking these general rules and you're applying them to all the situations in front of that may come before you. Then the other 2 variables are rationality and irrationality, and that's kind of easy to understand. So rational then means reason, logic, intellect, law that is practiced in an independent legal system. Irrationality then is laws that are based upon mysticism or faith or superstitions. So you have these 4 different variables: substantive, formal, irrationality, and rationality, and you combine them together and you get what you see on this slide: substantive irrationality, substantive rationality, formal irrationality, and formal rationality, the one he decided was most conducive to capitalistic progress. And there's a table in your textbook, I think it's table 1.2. I don't have it in front of me right now, but here's just another version of it. So you can look at this table and see examples of these different typologies and it kind of helps things make sense. So you look at substantive in the column and irrational in the row, and you get substantive irrationality, an example of which is the story of Solomon and the 2 mothers in the Bible. I'll let you look that up so you can see what it's about, that it's just a situation where a king or a sovereign is making a decision on a case-by-case basis, but he's just relying on whim. There's no code that he's applying. Now go across to formal irrationality, where you would have a system or a systematic process for making a decision, but you're just doing it on sort of a illogical way. And an example of that I've got here are the Salem witch trials. So they would decide if you've probably read about it, but they decided who was a witch based upon certain responses to the questions that were given in their trials. Now move down to substantive rationality. So that's where you have some abstract intellectual rules that you're applying, but they're not legal rules. They're coming from something other than the law. An example then is the Code of Hammurabi, where the king of Babylon is using the word of I think it was the sun god, and he was applying it on a case-by-case basis to pass judgments on certain situations. And then finally, you've got formal rationality, which is our current modern legal code. And according to Weber, that's why we have modern economic progress or capitalism that allowed Western European cultures to survive and thrive. Next, we have the sociologist Emile Durkheim. So he's also, like Weber, looking at economic division of labor and economic progress and studying the changes in society that he saw over the course of history. He had a different idea, though. He focused less on decision making and more on the division of labor and social solidarity. So what I mean by social solidarity is this sort of shared sense of moral order that a society would have. And that in turn would affect how those members would relate to one another socially and economically. So, for example, in non-industrial societies, so this is a long time ago, before we had modern tools and means of communication and means of travel, so non-industrial, pre-industrial societies, their social solidarity was mechanical, and it was based upon commonality of experience. We're talking about societies that are very isolated. They don't have interaction with other cultures. So everyone does the same thing. You can think about hunters and gatherers or fishing cultures. Everybody does the same work. We all do the same thing. So it's commonality of experience that drives our laws and the way we relate to one another. There's strongly enforced behavioral norms, no deviation, no tolerance for difference, a strong collective conscience. If you do something against their sort of norms, their codes, you're going to get stoned. You might have your hand cut off. I mean, these are some pretty repressive, retributive forms of justice, harsh punishment, little tolerance for deviation from their norms. Well, then with technology then comes a different type of social solidarity. With technology, you can allow specialization and division of labor, where you've got cultures with different, some differences. You've got people who will adopt trades. You'll have a butcher who gives you your meat. You will have a baker who gives you your bread. You will have a mason or a carpenter who helps you build your home. You will have a doctor who treats your illness, a lawyer who deals with disputes. And it's like organs in the human body. Each organ kind of has its own function, and they're all connected together to form this overall body that functions well. So that's organic solidarity. So industrial societies, he saw using this organic solidarity to relate to one another with a strong division of labor and a good tolerance for differences. So in industrial societies, you're going to see more restitutive forms of justice, reparations instead of stoning, for example. And our last theorist here is really a pair, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. I'm pretty sure you've probably heard of both of these guys before. So Karl Marx, or Marxism, I'm sure you've heard that's, a system of government that was built around his theories, Marxism. Anyway, Marx and Engels' perspective was that laws were consensually valid in a group, but they were guaranteed through coercion. So this is a notion that there's a separate group that coerces adherence to laws upon other people. So these other people, the ruled people, the working class, they're sort of tricked into believing that the laws serve everyone's best interests. He called it false consciousness. So the ruled or the working class mistakenly believe that the laws are in their best interests. They're duped by virtue of the control that the ruling class has over them. So it's the wealthy control the decision makers. The wealthy control social institutions, and therefore the wealthy can control how people are taught and what rules apply. And they abuse that power to trick this ruling class into compliance, to coerce them into compliance, and hold them back. there's a little quote from the textbook. Well, it's not from the textbook. It's probably from Karl Marx. Those with the gold make the rules. Instead of the golden rule, those with the gold make the rules. So laws are just disguised as offering mutual benefit, but they really don't. So his theory then was given the name conflict theory. Conflict theory, according to Marx, was the belief that society is unjust. It is unequal and it is discriminatory. A ruled class coerces the ruling class coerces the ruled people, the ruled class, into adhering to laws that really just benefit the rich, the ruling class. Even though they seem to benefit everyone, they really don't. But that is simply a reaction to consensus theory, which is probably the theory that would be adopted by all of the other theorists I've taught you about today. Consensus theory is far more optimistic and believes that laws are actually maintained for the benefit of the common good, to keep the peace and order in a civilized society. And conflict is temporary. It's only something that can be resolved through peaceful decision-making and the application of fair and just laws. Legal codes and legislation are just a product of compromise. There's no coercion. All interest groups are heard, their voices are reflected in the democratic process, and the ultimate laws are just an expression that came about through this fair democratic process. And because of that democratic process, people will trust and respect and obey the law. All right, that's all for this chapter. I'm going to stop there. I want to remind you, however, to pay attention to the assignments that we have. I'll have assignments posted on Blackboard on the agenda. You might have already seen it. One is a quiz that is based upon this lecture in PowerPoint as well as your textbook. And the other is a little activity for concept mapping. Please make sure you have them turned in by their respective due dates. If you have any questions, please email me. I'm happy to respond and answer them. I'm happy to hold virtual teleconferences with you to talk about any of this material. I hope you have a great day.